All right. So we are about to discuss the design of our efforts at computational bibliographic citations. So for people who are in the Twitch universe, you're basically eavesdropping on a working meeting, working on design of features for Wolfram Language. This particular feature is one that I have not yet seen, that's been developed by, don't know exactly who developed this, but I suspect they're in this meeting and we're about to learn about it. Okay, so the question is, we have a number of places in our knowledge base where we have references. For example, this seems to be Einstein on the present state of the radiation problem. Okay, but it's a mess because it says Physik Zeit. I don't even know what Zeit means, Zeitschriften or something.
Physikalische Zeitschrift.
What? Physikalische Zeitschrift. Okay. Okay, so the question is, how should we computably represent those references? Is that the question, what we're addressing here?
Yeah.
Okay, and so what you're proposing, wait a minute, that said entity physical constant. What? Oh, you cheated there. And what's the, so
the first one is kind of the main decision to be made. Like the molecule, is it an entity or is it a function?
I kind of think this is a function, because I think what's going to happen is that we're going to want to do, so for example, we have the notion of okay, well, let's start off with what, I mean, okay, a DOI is like a URL. And a DOI is equivalent to what we have here, correct?
Although there are actually a few cases where the same document has multiple DOIs. It is not supposed to happen, but it does actually happen.
Yes. And not every document out there does have a DOI.
Obviously. I mean, has anybody gone back and given DOIs to things from 1913? No, probably not.
No, Wiley has done it completely. A couple of publishers have gone 100% back.
Yeah, but what about the publishers that are no longer in business?
For instance, that was not done.
Right. I mean, clearly, a publisher from the 1600s who isn't in business anymore, who's going to put DOIs on that? Who would consider themselves responsible for putting DOIs on that?
For instance, JSTOR did DOI on many, many old things.
Okay.
No, sorry, that's incorrect. Sorry, that's incorrect. Not JSTOR, somebody else.
Okay. But does JSTOR also have an ID for their things?
Yes.
Which is distinct from the DOI?
Yes.
So what we've got here, we've got DOIs, we've got JSTOR IDs.
There comes a list further down.
Oh, okay.
I think JSTOR is the source of some of the duplicated DOIs because they didn't go back and double check that there wasn't already one, and their content in some cases duplicates content on other sites, like some of the American Math Society journals, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay, so the typical thing you might want to do here. So, for example, I just did, in fact, just did last night a bibliographic study about Mr. Darcy Thompson, where I was looking at, so this was by year, I was looking at, well, by decade, I was looking at the, and I just happened to have this on my screen. I was looking at the frequency of words in abstracts, right? So I don't know how that would be related. I mean, here, for example, it would be good, wouldn't it, to be able to get the actual title of the paper and things, the complete bibliographic, not just the citation, but the complete bibliographic information here. Don't you think? I mean, a structure that can store that. I mean, just like with the thing I was looking at previous here, it had, let's see, what did it have? It had the fields, and it was a mess, right? So this was, you know, this is some titles here, right? The fields here were, look at all these messy titles with incorrect capitalization and so on. But the fields were, you know, it's probably a Dublin core-ish type thing, I would guess. I don't know. Title authors, corporate authors, etc. Right? So this is some kind of ontology What is average per year? Oh no, that's different. Well, who knows? Is this, are you recognizing what this is? Is this some standard thing that I'm looking at here? Anybody?
Aaron might know, but he's not here today.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, but so what is your comment on my statement that we actually want the complete bibliographic citation, which includes author, you know, the whole.
If you look farther down, my comment is yes and no. I mean, there are a couple times 10 to the 8 of them, so it will be not realistic to have them all, and many of them have to be.
No, I understand. I understand that.
But we also need the possibility to have them in this form. And we need the possibility to go from the complete one to the abbreviated one.
Right, I understand. And to reformat them for different styles and so on.
Yes, exactly.
So, I mean, we've had for like at least 15 years, maybe 20, we've had these various BibTeX importers and things. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
How does that work? I don't even know what it imports into. So if I look up, well, that's not impressive. Okay, citation management. I don't know. Oh, this is EndNote. Hello? Somebody is not on mute and should be. Hello? Hello? Somebody is not on mute.
I think it's the PR team.
Somebody is not on mute. Somebody is not on mute.
That's better now, it sounds like.
Okay. No, not better. That's not working.
I think we know who it is. We just got a pinger.
Okay. That's not allowed to happen. These meetings have to be, if we're going to do this live like this, we kind of have to have it so that it's not distracted.
Right.
Otherwise, we don't get to do this. Okay, how does this work, this EndNote thing?
Is that better? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. Yep. No, we still got that background.
Back and forth.
Okay, I'm going to go on mute here myself for a minute.
Yeah, I passed the note along too. Let's see if we can improve on this.
All right. Let's try to go back to this. All right. So how does this work? In what format does this generate citations? Okay. So we seem to have some technical problem here. So we got a lot of background noise. We need to solve the technical problem before we go on. Oh, now we've not got background noise.
It was clearly cut off, so somebody has to mute. Hopefully that's not cutting off the rest of the sound.
Okay. All right. Okay. So in what form does
I think we just lost Stephen too for network dropout, so we'll have to see if we can get back in.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Hey, yep, you're back.
Okay. Okay. You hearing me again? Okay. So what's the answer to how this works with BibTeX? Can somebody answer that for me? Anybody there?
You mean the citation insertion?
No, I mean, what is the format that it uses, right? So it's got a.
I mean, BibTeX, of course, has its own format, right?
No. I'm asking what fields does it have? We have an association here that represents, or it should be an association that represents the different elements of a citation.
You really shouldn't look too much on this one. That's really not representative. If you go further down in the notebook, there comes.
Okay, but I'm asking the question, does somebody know what BibTeX does? No?
You mean, does it do it like an association, or does it do it like some other
I'm
construct?
asking a simpler question. I'm just asking, what are the fields that it supports? Or does it support arbitrary fields?
It will support arbitrary fields, but there's a certain vanilla set of fields, and publishers all define what fields they care about too.
Okay, fine. But so, I mean, if I look here at what it says it has some kind of author, title, publisher, et cetera, thing. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I think it has some default fields, and if you add more, typically the styles using these will ignore them.
I see. Okay, fine. I understand. So it's not really it's just an empty container, so to speak.
Yes. It's more the styles using it that defines what they expect, and they ignore the rest.
Okay. All right. Let me scroll down here so that I'm actually understanding what you guys are talking about. Okay. So what are you showing here? You're showing examples of where we use this stuff. Is that correct?
Yes, and that we are currently not uniform, and we would greatly benefit by being uniform.
Okay. Fine. Okay. So you're just showing bad examples here, basically.
Not bad.
Just examples.
The world doesn't do it uniform.
No, I understand. Okay. So what's this?
This is currently, like, with respect to alpha needs, like, these are currently our sources that we have in the knowledge base.
I see. Wow, I didn't know those were entities. And so what are the properties of those entities? I didn't know we had those as entities.
This is the back end of microsourcing in alpha.
I didn't know it was an entity property store.
Yeah, well, these are attached to individual properties. So this is just property level sourcing in alpha. This is how they're represented.
Okay, well, that's useful. That's good. What is this doing here? Two general, okay. All right, so I see, this is your list here. DOIs, archive, reference, numbers, URLs. Okay. Okay. But the Wikidata items are not the same type of thing.
We discussions with Ellen, and we might want still to have a way to point to one of them.
I understand, but we've talked about an external reference mechanism for a long time, right? That is analogous to URL, but is our own. And what are we doing right now? If we have an entity and you want to find its Wikipedia representation, how do we do that? Do we have a mechanism for that now?
You're breaking up heavily. There's a way you can access that ID, but it is not documented or promoted in any way. That's a related thing that we should talk about when we figure out what we want to do with this. And I had been thinking that if we had some kind of reference, I guess this is a function, that's a different thing, but if we had some kind of a reference object, that's how we would want to represent those things. Want to come back in the US with the identifier of a particular entity.
So hold on, let's look at what we had previously talked about. I think we had discussed some time ago external, let's see.
Reference.
Yeah, external reference. Does anybody know whether we have notes on that?
I think there's a sort of a ref page futurized somewhere. That's about the extent of it.
Should we look for that?
Sure.
Okay, but the idea, I think, was, what was it called, external reference? Oh yeah, look at that. What do you know? Okay, represents an external reference from a given source with a given name. Entity of external reference evaluates the entity when the entity is known in the language. was our concept.
Possibly, or we would use toEntity for that.
Right. That would also be reasonable. But so, this concept of an external reference seems like a good concept, because some of these places, I mean, to me, the modern URL scheme is not that different from an old-fashioned, physrev let, 3875, whatever. You see what I'm saying? That's a URL as well, in a sense, a URI as well. Michael, do you think that's a correct interpretation?
I think so.
So, in effect, and they're all a bit hierarchical, like it's a journal, a journal, a volume a year. I mean, the volume and year, there's redundancy in the case of, there's built-in redundancy from the volume and year stuff. But okay, but so then if what we're planning is some kind of external reference, and I don't know whether that's the right name, but right now, if I have a random entity, like I say, I don't know, let's say tungsten or something, right? Can I get the wiki? Can I get what that is in Wikipedia?
Wikipedia, capital E, lower N, capital ID.
Wikipedia.
ENID.
EN? Like that?
Like I said, these are not exposed. It's just lowercase n.
Okay.
This is just
ID like that?
English Wikipedia, yeah.
Like that? Well, that was unimpressive. Are you sure that's the right name?
Yes.
Not capital N?
Yes. I mean that's the right thing that works now. It's like I said, it's not promoted. It's not what it should be if we're going to expose and promote that anywhere.
Yeah, right. I understand. But so, oh yeah, there we go. So what is that ID number?
That's the ID for that Wikipedia page. You can
and
do
how
Wikipedia,
do you get to the?
You could do Wikipedia data of page ID goes to that, and you would get that page. I can never remember offhand what the URL syntax is, but there's a Wikipedia URL that you can use that ID number instead of a page title.
Cool.
It'll resolve to that page.
It seems to me that an external reference concept is a good idea, and this is really the only problem is that there's a more general version of external reference, which could be some kind of weird, object in an external program type thing, which I don't think is really the same kind of thing. This is an external fixed, external identifier more than an external reference, perhaps. Am I making sense?
In this case, you have the entity different from the external identifier to Wikipedia or something. When it comes to a book or an article, the two things seem to be mixed. So would we have an entity for a book and a reference to the book itself, something like that?
I see. So the question is, the sort of ontological question is Moby Dick and a reference, like if we say page 75 of Moby Dick, whatever that even means, given that there are many editions and so on. But let's imagine, let's take that as an example, okay? Page 75 of Moby Dick. And then we ask the question, is Moby Dick like a URL, merely like a piece of a URL, or is Moby Dick an entity in itself?
Exactly.
Right. So I think the analogy of that for journal citations would be, I would imagine, I don't know whether we have this, but I would think like physical review is probably, it's taking a long time to do this. It doesn't know what it is. That's really weird. Do we not have these? I thought we had journal serials as an entity type. We do. Why doesn't it physical review? Oh, because it's physical review A, B, C, D. Okay, so that will be an example. That's an entity, right? Physical review letters. Make sense?
Yes.
And I think so. Just like presumably Moby Dick is an entity, which is that book. So my claim would be that the sub-indexing, that's really strange. Why would we not know what that was? Assuming Moby Dick is a novel.
Oh, is this the default? Because we have famous text as a separate thing from book, and so that's probably the default assuming for that one.
Okay, well, we should fix it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Should perhaps external identifier take the entity and return a link to that entity or something like that?
Sorry, go ahead. What should? Okay, so the problem is that we need to subcase in here. So, for example, one thing, we could imagine that there's an entity, Wikipedia, and then we're subcasing to page IDs and so on. Just like, the top of this, hierarchy for books, the top of the hierarchy is the book, is the book name, so to speak, right? There isn't, whereas for a journal, there's subcasing into phys rev letters, volume such and such, page such and such. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
So, there's an anchoring entity, is some kind of concept, and then there's subcasing into that. And then there are things like the DOIs and so on, which are in a sense their own. So an argument would be that one could say something like external, a possibility would be something like external identifier, and then one could actually say phys rev letters, and then one would be saying, let's say, for example, the main source is phys rev letters, and then there's the sub sources. Then there's an association which gives the sub information here. Is that obviously stupid?
It's not stupid, but I don't know why you would want this and for what purposes.
Okay. Let's just make a thing here.
I think actually the reverse direction is the much more important and interesting one.
Okay, which is what?
If you go down a little bit, given the DOI, give me a convenient and nice way to get all the fields.
Okay, well, hold on a second. So what you're saying here is given, what is this? Okay, so this is flipping it around the other way. So this is the second argument here is the base, basically. And then this is the sub identification. Yeah. Okay. Is that what we do? That is what we're doing now for URL, right?
Yes.
Right, which is nice that you can go and open it. Okay. Yeah, okay, so this is the sub-referencing thing. Okay. Yeah, that's a good concept, that we need some sub-referencing mechanism. Okay, features of references. Okay.
We have a DOI and we have a nice convenient way to get actually data to do something with.
Okay, and this is using, what is work information? What does that mean? Oh, that's information about the work.
Yeah.
With that DOI. And where is this going? What is Crossref?
Crossref is one of the keepers of DOIs and related.
Okay, so they have a public API. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So if I were to look at what is, I see. So I'm taking that, and this is a request to that service to give me that DOI. Okay, and so I'm getting a bunch of information there. Cool. Okay, but it's not canonicalized. So we would have to. This is uncooked service. Connected service, right? You guys hearing me?
It cooked a little. We've got
canonicalized in some sense. in their sense, not in ours.
No, I understand, but in our sense, like, okay, I mean the dates.
We haven't turned URLs into URLs.
And we certainly haven't turned communications to the ACM, which is surely an entity for us, right?
But everything that comes back from Crossref is also surely not an entity.
But all the ISSN numbered journals should be entities. Insofar as it has journals that have ISSNs, we should have entities for them, if I'm not mistaken. Correct?
I don't know how complete it is.
No, it's not.
We added a lot of journals somewhat recently, but I don't think we've got.
Okay, fine. But in principle, in worst case,
yeah,
we could imagine a journal that is merely specified by its ISSN, if all else failed, which is another one of these parameterized, things with a base. That is, ISSN is the base, just as DOI is a base, to represent a parameterized entity kind of thing, I think. Okay, making references from data. Okay. Let's see. So here, okay, given a reference, we want to create a DOI, is that correct? Are you guys there, or did you lose me?
Yeah, we want to do this sometimes. If you have some old stuff, you have old paper that have it in old style, BibTeX.
Okay, and so the other issue is given this is a nice thing. Given being able to generate citations in a certain order, and there are people where their whole business is basically maintaining databases of citations and putting them out in different formats, right? Okay, but now what about, okay, so this is importing BibTeX. Okay, so this is this BibTeX format, and you're saying, can we import that right now? Do we have a mechanism for importing that right now?
I don't think so.
Well, this is not necessarily BibTeX. This is the Bib item in which you are fully free to put whatever you want there. And it will be translated as it is into the paper.
Okay, so look, seems to me that what we want is, first thing we want is this notion of external identifier, which seems like it's a constant feature across a bunch of these places. And that would be analogous to, URI, universal whatever resource identifier, right? This is a version of that is a variety of different forms of external identifier. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay. So then what we've got is we've got somehow the base of the external identifier, and we've got its detail. Does that make sense? So for example, that base could be, there are a variety of different kinds of things. That could be a Wikipedia page ID, maybe. And then the detail is some number here. What else? Or
you also need to specify a language.
Right. Well, so in fact, this base object here really should be an entity, typically. That could be, that could be an entity of type, let's see, identifier system effectively is what it comes down to. So what are examples of identifier systems? an example would be a DOI, a Wikipedia page ID, Wikipedia in language X page ID. Is that right? Another identifier system, and I think you already had some of these up above, were URL. Another one is ORCID. Another one could be PubChem ID, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So then these, for a DOI, does that DOI's different pieces have a, have a meaning there?
I think it's very flexible and up to the publisher to
Okay.
assign the meaning.
So another thing that could be here is an ISBN, where obviously the components do have a meaning. Right? And so these base identifier systems. Okay, so one question is either the base or the, what can we call this? This is actually the identifier itself. So for example, URL. Go ahead.
You can pick any arbitrary Wikidata page, for example, and it's going to have a list of identifiers associated with that thing, mapping out into other various systems.
Okay.
I mean, just to look at some other examples.
Yeah. Okay. Well, how do I get to one of those?
Just go to Wikidata, look up Barack Obama.
Well, where do I go here? Search. Let's search for tungsten. Chemical element. Okay.
Scroll down. Yep.
Okay. Does anybody put our entity identifiers here?
No.
And this will be very confusing to look for us on this page, but okay. But anyway, so these are typical things. These would be typical types of identifier systems, right? And each one of these could then be so if there is a notion of an identifier system, and one of these might be whatever there's one here called ZVG number, then, for example, that identifier system as an entity can have various properties. Does that make sense? I think a lot of you are on mute because we were having so many of those audio problems. If you have a reasonable audio setup, why don't you get off mute so we can actually tell who's agreeing or disagreeing?
Are you thinking of this only for bibliography or something more general?
No, I'm thinking of it for any place where we have to have an external reference, an external way, a thing that is not part of our knowledge base's identification system. And what you are describing here seems to be a quintessential case of that, which is these journals where the base, in effect, is, where the base, okay, is basically a journal. Right now here, okay, so the other case would be, is a book a possible base? Certainly an encyclopedia, for example, might be a possible base. Is this making sense to people?
Yes.
Because
what I'm a little bit concerned is that this list of bases is potentially very, very large. If you, for instance, think on preprint series of institutes, there are thousands of institutes that have their own preprint series.
So what? It's an identifier system. If it's got, MIT, lab for computer science report such and such, why not?
Because we must maintain a list of properties for each identifier. Well,
if they don't have very many properties, they don't have very many properties. I mean, minimal properties will be I understand. The more properties it has, the happier it is. But we don't have to have properties for all of these things.
And we
Let's
must
look
also have potential interfaces to get the objects themselves.
That's correct. If the objects can be got.
Work, potentially.
What's that?
Will be quite a lot of work to maintain this for thousands.
Well, fine. But I mean, we don't have to start with thousands. We're looking at a small number here. I mean, what we want is an extensible system, because if somebody comes up with another, another identifying system, we don't want to not be able to do it because, whoops, we only designed for 3 of them or something.
I don't understand how book is a base, though. I thought the idea of the base is the scheme that includes books, right?
Yeah, well, I think that's a weird case, which is why I put it in brackets. Okay? In other words, encyclopedia is a valid base because there are fairly few encyclopedias in the world. Right? See what I'm saying? I mean, in other words, if it was some, but books, there are whatever it is, 20 million or something of these things. And so that's a little bit more bizarre. So the question is, when you want to refer to a book, in your scheme for references over here, when you, do books have DOIs?
Not sure.
No. Springer has DOIs for every chapter.
Chapter, yeah.
Oh, that's crazy weird.
No, it's very convenient. So you can very pointed, because they also sell by chapter. So it's very sensible.
Okay. So wait a minute. So then so there can be DOI by chapter. So that right there tells us that my scheme of having a base and an identifier isn't completely stupid, even for a book. That is, in a book, like I was giving the Moby Dick example, page 77, whatever that means in whatever edition it is, right? See what I'm saying?
But it would then fall under DOI, not under book.
If it is a DOI, yes, but I'm saying the question is, look, what we're saying here is that the base here, I mean, what's awkward about this is, okay, this base is the concept of a URL, not a specific URL. What we're really seeing here is that there's a multi-level thing. So what we'd end up with is external identifier. What we could end up with is something like where the entity type, entity of the identifier system is book. Then the actual identifier, however that's represented here, is Moby Dick, for example. And then where there's a sub entity here which says, some kind of, page 77 or something. Does that make sense?
But this would need concretely where published, by whom, when.
To know what page 77
yes,
means.
Otherwise it makes no sense yet.
I agree. But now, how do we represent a book? So, I mean, a typical way that we would represent a book, what's a good book that, here's a good book.
Publisher and edition.
Hopefully that book exists as an entity. Okay, so there, and what is our canonical representation of that book? That's kind of lame. So that's clearly a non-extensible representation there. But that has various properties, right?
Well, is it clear that we need the bases to be validated so that users can only use those bases that we have in advance? Or rather, they could, perhaps instead they could have these in a way that they can write whatever they want.
Actually, I've got a simpler solution. There's no reason why this base, so one of the type, this is the right way to do it. Look, if we have external identifier, the most typical base will be an identifier system, right? But that doesn't need to be the base. The base could be a book entity or a journal entity. See what I'm saying? So if we have external identifier here, then what we can have is indeed our physical review letters right there, right? Which is a periodical. And then its actual identifier is whatever the, volume, page, whatever. Did that make sense?
Again, yes, but I feel like the DOI is much better.
But maybe better, but that's okay. That's a different external identifier. What's your point? I mean, there's no guarantee that, as we know, there is not a unique external identifier for a given object. right? As you've said, even among DOIs, there can be duplicates. And what I'm saying is that given, you can have multiple external identifiers, and you might want a way of coercing them, transforming them into, for example, you might say, what is the DOI of this, right? So potentially what you want there is maybe, I don't know, something like external identifier of entity, blah, 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 blah. DOI effectively is the thing there, and then another external identifier here, and that will be the way of casting the first external identifier into a DOI external identifier, if that's possible. Am I making sense? Just like we would potentially have entity of external identifier if we have an entity that corresponds to that external identifier.
So what about things that have zero web presence? How would they be represented?
Well, what's an example?
A random French math journal from 1805 that has not been digitalized.
Okay. Where you're saying we don't know the base URL for the thing.
Correct. There is no currently.
Okay. Okay, so that's an issue of how to deal with. So for that, what you're telling me is that there is no entity that can go here. The only thing we could put there is something which says, well, okay, so then I think the best we could do would be to have an entity identifier system of, just journal, for example, and then the actual payload would contain the journal name such as we know it.
Right.
And that's the best we could do. Now, I'm not completely happy with the asymmetry between, in this case here, we're putting this in, it might be better to instead have something where we say, and we say something where the whole thing is an association, where we're saying something like base is, and then it's an entity, or base is something like, and then we have to have certain. See, the problem is that there's going to be a template. If we know it's a journal, right, then we know it has certain things in it. Right? So we know it has certain fields. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If we know it's a book, okay, so given the type of identifier system being used, there are certain fields. And yeah, go ahead.
The one thing that somehow still worries me is the following. While when we know the external base, we know a lot about the thing. If we don't know the external base, we know nothing about the thing. We do not even know it is a paper or something like this.
Well, then how can we cite it in any way? If we know nothing about it, then we know nothing and there's nothing to say. What do we know? In other words, we've got to have something that we start with. Otherwise, there's nothing to say.
Right.
But perhaps precisely we need a reference in which we put all we know and then a function that looks for the possible external identifier of that thing.
Okay, so what you're suggesting...
In the box of papers of Leibniz, whatever, there's somewhere a piece of paper. Now we're published... Okay, Leibniz is mostly online.
Or letters.
Letters,
but letters between scientists, which surely are republished in collected works and such. But how do you refer to them?
Yeah, I'll show you a beautiful example here, right here. I've got right there. There's a page. How do you refer to that?
Exactly.
Good question. Okay, so the answer to that is in some archive somewhere. It's in a physical archive.
Yes.
Okay, so that's okay. So then we've got this notion of physical archives, and actually, somebody just gave me a thing. What is it called? Some maybe Stanford Libraries or something. Somebody is trying to make up a standardized format for that. Gosh, what is it? I don't remember, but that's that is a perfectly reasonable case as a physical archive. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that what that should be then is just like we have a base that is a journal where we know it's a journal, right? We don't know anything else, but we know it's a journal. So then a possible other base here would be a physical archive. And then given that it's a physical archive, people have various ways to refer to them. I mean, for instance, the sad fact is when you actually get into the archive, it's in boxes. It's usually in some very obscure place. It's often quotes off-site of wherever you're going, and it's in, and maybe there you would have, I mean, like if you look at, I don't know, the British Museum's information on let's take a look. I mean, if we look, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I've looked at these. Let's say, let's go to British Library, search the catalog. So if we say, if it will even get me there, everything in the catalog. Okay, so let's say Ada Lovelace. Then, okay. So let's say, so these are books, it looks like, right? Okay, somebody is breathing into the phone, but anyway, so how did they reference this book? So they have, that's just their, oh, okay, doc equals British Library. I bet that's an accession number of some kind. It's a pity that Aaron is not here today because he would know all this stuff. But let's see, notes and tags. No, that's not relevant. Details. Ah, there we go. Look at this. UIN, BLL, whatever. That's some identifier, system number, whatever. Right? Makes sense?
Yeah, I still feel there's one point missing. Sorry. Like the original idea, if you have a reference, it's pretty clear what the reference is, in the sense of it's probably some kind of piece of paper or a bunch of pieces of paper with some information on it. But now as an external identifier, I feel like it could be any kind of physical artifact in the museum. And in our current scheme, I don't see a programmatic way to determine if it's a reference rather than a physical artifact.
Yeah, right. And it could be, look, it could be an IoT device that's sitting, in a turtle nest or something, and it happens to be, who knows? I mean, yes, that's right, but that's the point, is to have a system where we can deal with both the references case that you're highlighting here and the more general case.
But for instance, one workflow for the reference case would be, I have a DOI and I would conveniently in the front end make the equivalent of make hyperlink, which makes no sense for a general external identifier.
Okay, but the DOI, you're just saying the DOI doesn't happen to have its prefixed URL stuff, but you want to make a link from it. Is that right?
No, within the notebook to the reference section at the end of the notebook.
What?
Like a normal paper. In the main text, you say see ref 12, and at the end of the notebook, you have references, and there's 12. And I don't want to manually type it. I want to automate this.
Okay, but what does that have to do with this? I don't understand. That this is.
It only makes sense for something that is a reference. It doesn't make sense for a generic.
Why? I mean, it could be as well saying, the random pot dug up on, in this place that shows up, that's in the British Museum.
Oh, I see your point. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, for example, the type specimens of biological species, I don't exactly know how there's a reference. Does anybody know that? In other words, there's always a, somewhere in some museum, in some jar, is some horrifying dead creature that is the type specimen for such and such a species. And
well, so you're broadening the system essentially. I mean, this project started with the idea of just building bibliographies of references.
No, I understand, but what I'm saying is, I'm trying to find an example of a type reference. Type specimen, who knows? Okay, but in any case, yes, but what I'm trying to do is put this in a more general framework that we can reuse for other things.
Yeah, and that's fair.
Right. So,
and then maybe as long as it's a framework that looks pretty clear, the subset of that framework that is most relevant to doing references and docs is what we would return to. Well,
I think so, but I mean, I think we can look, we've been meaning to do this external identifier thing, which we've already got tons of data for Wiki and other things. So this, for example, there's a couple of different ways we could do this. We could say, given an external identifier, what is the URL associated with that? Or we could say, if there is a canonical URL, we can have that as a property there, or hyperlink or something. Am I making sense? And that way, if there is a canonical URL for it, but there may not be a canonical URL. For example, consider a book where there is a version of it that's been scanned and is on the web, but there is also an Amazon catalog reference. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure. They live in various different ways.
Right. So given, and by the way, I mean, that's another typical example would be the Amazon catalog, would be another typical thing that has IDs. But here, I think for books, they're based on the ISBN, aren't they?
Typically, yeah.
But then there's also, I mean, in the what are they called? UPC codes is another example. So UPC codes are a mess.
But and they're everything. They cover anything and everything.
In principle.
Can of beans.
Sure, but the UPC code for a can of beans from a particular manufacturer, it's a messy, I mean, look, there are many, look, we made that whole giant poster of different schemes like this. Anyway, so.
But it sounds like we have to support that or allow for that to be supported.
Right. But so the issue here is multiple destinations from an external identifier. I mean, clearly, we could perfectly well have something.
But with a given base, it's mostly unique or not?
With one of these things, which is an identifier system, I would say
mostly, not the 100%.
Mostly. If the book has an ISBN, it's still in copyright, and there probably isn't a there's not a complete version of it on the web. But okay. But so let's go back. Let's loop back to the stuff about references again. Okay, let's use that as an example to understand this, because I think
one more question. I'm still wrapping around about this more general concept of external identifier. So, say VIN numbers would be external identifiers.
What numbers?
VIN for cars.
Yeah, vehicle identification numbers.
Yeah, why not?
Okay.
I mean, and look, by the
even
time
if
we've
there's
got
no place where you could go easily.
Well, there might be. I mean, there's certainly service connections that we can have to places that will do that. IP addresses, obviously, we already have, but IP address, we already have a notion of an IP address.
Right? Phone numbers would be external references.
That's correct. We also have that notion, which we're, those ones are really a different story, because those are ones that we are supporting independently, right?
But we have to agree that they are a subset of what could be expressed this way.
Right. So then what we've got to do is we've got to have something where if you say external identifier, we might need, I mean, that's, it's not canonical at this point. You have an external identifier where an entity, the identifier system is IP address, right? And the payload is whatever the IP address, 140.177. whatever. Okay, but that has got to be equivalent to, something like IP address of that raw string. Make sense?
Yeah.
Now, the fact that it isn't unique, well, tough luck. I mean, none of these things are unique, right? And the only question is, what are the translations? How do we get the translations? And, to know whether, the identity question for two things, that you thought were the same thing, that's a really hard question. And ultimately, it's going to be unanswerable.
But it's also a little bit misleading to, if the head is called external identifier and not external object, then the identifier is either equal or not, trivially. The object the identifier refers to has a more different equality structure.
Yeah, but the identifier as an identifier can be equal or not, but that which it identifies might not be the same.
Exactly, but what I'm saying is currently you kind of a little bit make them equal.
I agree that this case is an awkward case because this is a transformation of identifiers in the space of identifiers. It's not saying, is the machine at the end of that IP address the same machine? I agree that this is an awkward case, right? These are essentially our, what can I say, the slang or something for an external identifier in particular cases.
But the same is true for the earlier one. Like the paper itself is different from the identifier of the paper.
Yes, but this is an identifier. What we are, the thing we're bouncing around here is an identifier, not the actual paper.
But typically we refer to a paper. We don't refer to an identifier for a paper in a reference.
Okay, but look, let's, to be completely bizarre about it, let's imagine the external identifier represented a program, let's say a piece of Wolfram Language code, right? In that case, unlike the notion of a paper, where at some point there are 1,000 printed copies of it somewhere, bits and hand it to somebody, right? And that is clearly a different thing. There is an identifier of the program. And by the way, this relates to how the resource system works, because, one possible external identifier is our very own resource system. I mean, that's a little weird, but not completely crazy. Right. So my claim is that what we are doing here is a calculus of identifiers, not a calculus of actual objects. Right. And the calculus of identifiers will contain things like, for example, in the calculus of identifiers, there's the question of, does this identifier contain another identifier? Yeah. What else is there in the calculus of identifiers? What else can you ask?
But if I correctly understood, you would allow something like the first let example you have on the page to have one of the string argument authors, which I don't think the authors of the paper are the authors of the identifier.
Okay, that's a different thing. That's the annotation. Okay, you are right. That's an issue, right? So there are two things here. There is the identifier. Okay, that is a good point. I agree.
There's kind of a two-entity wrapped around the identifier.
No, but there's another point, which is that there are things. The identifier is the main thing upon which there can be sort of a calculus of identifiers. So, for example, well, the identifier might not have a date. The identifier is merely an identifier, but the identifier, given certain properties. Okay, so the basic point is the authors and things like that are properties of the identifier.
No, right? Of the object the identifier refers to.
Yes, I think we need a function that takes identifier and returns a reference with all the information that can be collected, including the identifier itself, or something more canonical.
I agree.
I see what you're saying. I don't think it should be called a reference, but I think it should be called
external object. But
no, that external object is something else. It's a different thing that we want to use.
But if this is always bibliographic, it could be bibliographic reference.
If we're dealing with bibliographic references, if that's what we want to. I mean, if it's a VIN, then that's a quite different story. You know, there is a car on a parking lot in this place type thing.
Right.
But I agree that if what we have here, you know, we could imagine something where what we're dealing with is bibliographic or citation or something, bibliographic citation of whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be, or alternatively, just citation of, well, citation data of the external identifier. Would not be a totally crazy thing to have. So that is asking of the external identifier. But then the question would be, then there's the question of how do you get the external identifier that corresponds to a particular citation. Given that you have the citation in your hand, or you're reading it in from somewhere, then what you'll want is something which is essentially an interpreter of, I don't exactly know what it is really here. It's something, some kind of, you know, but this isn't quite right. What's that? Go ahead.
You know, if you put author name, right, like just a name, would it try to return a bunch of possible identifiers?
Well, that's something which, okay, so the next question is in what are we storing this bibliographic data? If it's an entity store, then you can start querying the entity store, right? And for something like that cross-ref thing that you were showing earlier, well, okay, so is there a place where, go ahead, what is your thinking about how we actually store this data? Because what you're saying is, to make this interesting, in a sense, we have to be storing both the external identifiers, which is just a big bag of identifiers, and together with all kinds of properties of those external identifiers that are, for example, specific author names and titles.
Yeah,
and
so that interpreter can, you know, return.
But I will put it in the other way. So if this reference object has all the information that the user wants to have, and one of the fields is the identifier, in case you can access something related to that in the internet, then a collection of these reference objects could be placed at the end of a notebook, and we can refer to individual items, things like that. But
sorry, I missed this concept. Could you say again, Jose?
Yes, I'm thinking a bit of what could be done with BibTeX, in the sense that you have individual references in which you put the information that you want to have. It doesn't have to link to anything outside in the internet, and then you can put them at the end of a notebook somehow. And in the notebook, you can say, if you click in this number 1, it goes automatically to the first one of these references.
Okay, but what do you mean by goes to? I mean, do you mean scrolls the notebook down to it, or pops
exactly,
it up?
Scroll.
That's a little weird. I mean, that seems very old style.
Well, yeah, and you're saying that's self-contained in the notebook, and you know we did exactly that when we developed Publicon, and we have the means to probably extract a lot of that functionality again if we need.
Okay, but so this is in notebook. This is a different thing. In notebook references, right? So what is the modern world? I mean, if I'm starting to write a paper, this is an academic document about Smith's snails.
Mm-hmm.
Reference. Smith, and 1822.
Right, and typically that is a key to a bibliography that you've maintained yourself.
Right. So there's two levels.
Has been maintained for you.
Right. So there's two levels. That's a key which goes to your local bibliography, which then goes out again to the global bibliography of the world.
Potentially.
Yeah. I think my main point is having information, what you call local bibliography, allowing you to put every bit of information you want there.
Right, but I don't think that should be in a notebook. I think what that should be is you should have an entity store that you maintain of your bibliographic database, which is what people tend to do, right? Which has, so that I can go to my bibliographic database, and my personal bibliographic database, this is, you know, Smith 0157 or something.
Right, and you know, we did that, but what Jose is describing turned out to be useful too, and we provided that as an authoring tool where you click a citation insert, and you get a number of fields to fill out of the information you typically want to publish as part of your bibliography at the end of your.
Okay, so this is a question of the UX of whether you enter that information at in the middle of your document when you're
Right.
thinking about it. Okay, that's a UX issue, though.
Well, I mean, it is and it isn't, because that information is then stored in your notebook. It's not necessarily required to go out to a database, because the notebook itself can structure that and still render it, format it, and make it look good. And then that can be recovered as data by taking apart the cells you create.
Right, but that's a separate, that's the type of issue that we have of storing, that's what Iconize and the data set in notebook stuff does, is storing. I mean, I don't think we should think about it this way. I think we should think about it as, think about the entity store. If it's a question of locally caching the entity store within a notebook, locally saving it within a notebook, that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying? So in other words, you imagine there's a global entity store, which will be what people will typically actually want, but, and potentially, but maybe when they, they might want to peel off from their global entity store, a local entity store that can be transported with the notebook. I mean, for example, when you're reading somebody's paper on the web, you can be indexing into their global entity store, which is also in the cloud. Right? It's only the case where you send the person a notebook that is a free-floating, document where it has to have all that data right in it. Okay, but I want to come back to this question about, so, we've got one notion, which is this external identifier thing, but the other notion is, where does the annotation data that, where does the additional stuff that is in the form of, the author, blah, 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 blah. I mean, here, again, this is actually more complicated, because really this is an author string, because there might actually be an entity for the author, right? And the author string is an uncanonicalized, John B. Smith.
Yep.
Right? As opposed to author, I don't know what Smiths we have. I'm sure we have a variety of Smiths here.
Yeah, but you would also have to have, I mean, that's good, that entity, because we can provide a construct that's broken down, but you would want author first name, middle name, last name. You have to go into minute detail.
ORCID number.
References can be formatted all different ways, with first name or last name, or not.
Period,
right. Well, so that raises the question, just like we are talking about, so, I mean, look, other constructs. Okay, so just like we've been talking about the phone number case, right, where we have things like phone numbers and human identifier, basically, person, we had a notion of this, person name, personal name or something, where, yes, you can do all those kinds of things. You can have an honorific. You can have a what are they called, suffix, like
right.
John, whatever, the 17th or whatever.
Right.
And they might style the suffix differently. Some of them might style it in Roman numerals. Some of them might style it as a number. There's a lot of detail here, and we have curated some of those kinds of things, like the honorifics. I believe we've curated those, have we not? Alan, do you remember?
Yeah, person, title. We have a lot of those. There could always be more, but we have we have abbreviations for things, and we have the expanded forms of them. The full name as a property of the thing.
Let's look up one that I was. Oh, that's interesting. We don't have that. I think that's some kind of degree title thingy. We don't seem to have it. Okay, interesting. Okay, but in any case, the yes, one could imagine something like this, that is an attempt at a personal name identifier, which will never be unique, unless we have, obviously, in principle, we've got, social security number and things like that, which represents another one of these external identifiers, right? But so again, personal name is another one of these things that's full of annotation, full of non-unique, nice to have, but doesn't really identify anything necessarily. Am I making sense? right? Like knowing somebody is called John Smith doesn't tell you, there are many John Smiths in the world. And to nail it down, you have to have all sorts of, you might or might not be able to nail it down. I mean, that's the wonderful world of medical records and things like that, is knowing whether the two people are the same. But in any case, I mean,
of course, in the real world, sometimes people just want something that other people will acknowledge to other people that this is a valid reference and I did my homework. They don't care if it resolves. They just want it to have the right words with a journal that people recognize, and it has to look correct and correctly formatted. So all the details.
Yeah, I know. They teach
clearly in the entity world, we want to do better, but that's not in general what people do in the whole rest of the world.
No, I understand. They just want something that is printed on a page and where the teacher can say, yes, you put bibliographic citations in.
Or
Fair
the
enough.
editor, yeah.
Right. Well, that's nice. It's like that. What was that song about? Copied the Lobachevsky thing about copied his references from the Moscow phone directory.
Yes, Tom Lehrer.
Did I get that right? Yeah.
It's not Moscow. I can't remember where it is, but it's not
okay,
Moscow.
Whatever. But in any case, okay. So I don't think that's that is not what we aspire to provide, right? I mean, I want to come back to what can we compute from something like this, right? For example, the number of pages. We can compute something. Well, I don't know what that page ID is. That doesn't look like a page number. This maybe wasn't printed. A modern page number. That's an article number. Yeah, right. That's the article number, and that's the sequence within the article.
Yep.
Right. So what's your point there? I mean, so look, there is, okay, so what you're basically saying is that we could potentially have something called, just like we're saying personal name, we could have bibliographic citation, and it is just a wrapper, which is what you're calling reference here. And this is coming back to essentially your design from an hour ago or whatever it was, where it's essentially something like this. I don't know whether we can get away with the word citation. Do you think there's too many other? Well, we might be able to get away with the word citation.
Item?
Item? That is extremely general. What do you mean, bibliographic item?
Yeah.
I like citation.
Well, is it, I mean, what is the meaning of citation? To cite something is, what
is there a difference between a reference, a source, and a citation to a librarian? I would like Aaron to be here to answer that one.
Well, and I like thinking of the citation as what's in the narrative, whereas what's at the end of the journal is itself not the citation, but what the citation.
All right. Again, we are down one librarian in this discussion, so we can't answer that here. But let's imagine it's bibliographic item. Okay, then we've got all kinds of different things. We've got the journal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now in this scheme that we're discussing here, the external identifier of a bibliographic item might be its DOI. It might be some kind of canonicalized version of journal, volume, page, that type of thing. Does that make sense, Michael? In other words, so we can choose the external identifier for the journal case. I mean, back in the day when I knew about this stuff, there could be weird stuff, like there was a series sometimes. It was like, so it isn't quite like it's pure volume and page, unfortunately. But in a first approximation, there could be, an external identifier which is whose base is maybe, it could even be something like journal reference is the base, is a fuzzy base, not like DOI, which is a nice clean base, but this could be a fuzzy base where basically what then happens is you have journal, arrow, and then an entity here, and so on. I mean, I think that will be a way of dealing with this concept where we are. I think that's actually not a totally stupid way to do it, because that way, another version of this would be a very clean external identifier, DOI, arrow, and then the only thing that's there is some kind of number here. Am I making sense? So in other words, we get, And this case of this external identifier is a pruned version of the bibliographic citation. Right? That is attempting to be the identifier as opposed to being the full bibliographic item with or without. You know, for all you know, in this bibliographic item, there could be a picture of the thing. See what I'm saying? I mean, in the fields here, it could include page count. It could include, you know, abstract. It could include all kinds of stuff.
Yep.
You know,
including the identifier itself.
Absolutely, it can include the identifier. Like DOI, if it's a specific identifier like that.
Right.
Right. And so this then just becomes a repository, a canonicalized repository of bibliographic information, for which bibliographic item is a better name, I agree. Because that then, I mean, bibliographic suggests that it is some, okay. Unfortunately, you know, there's also this thing here. We might have to say something like type, and this is where it might get a little messy, right? Because this could be type journal as opposed to type book and so on, or type, you know, because you can imagine other things which are things like, you know, type personal communication, which has completely different fields associated with it. You know, who's it from, when was it, etc. Am I making sense? Which suggests to me that really what we want to do is bibliographic item really wants to concentrate on things like journals. Maybe
Journals,
not.
books, preprints, give or take. So.
Okay, but then what do you want the type to be? So maybe the type instead is...
The type is not journal. I think the type is journal article. Because we
okay, so the type is an article then. What's the difference between an article and a, you know, what's a blog post? I mean, this is a narrative document of some kind, right? As opposed to, well, a book, or as opposed to a personal communication, which is nothing, or as opposed to a pot in the British Museum, or the type specimen of a salamander. Which, again, probably we shouldn't, you know, the type specimen of the salamander isn't a bibliographic item. I suspect we should restrict ourselves, because there is a very definite notion. You know, right now, well, you know, you can refer to blog posts, you can refer to Wikipedia articles in a journal, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I mean, look, there are fields that exist, you know, when it was, so this is the standard stuff that, for example, in a resource object, right? In resource objects, we actually have these fields, do we not? So if I look at a typical resource object for, okay, let's take a look at the fields that we already have here. So yeah, here we go. So these are typical source metadata, subset of the doubling core metadata standard. Right, so that gives us some, I mean, again, that's its own weird thing. I suspect if we try and generalize bibliographic item too much, we're going to wind up having it be the same as everything else again, and that we should really restrict it. But I'm more curious, what is the calculus of bibliographic items? See what I'm saying? So what do we have? We have containment, right? Does something contain something? Containment, overlapping, blah, blah, blah. We have various measures of size. Do we have, you know, we potentially have, you know, same author, you know, same attributes, i.e. same author, etc. We have a date, you know, we have date, place, things like that. Those are presumably computable things in many cases. The date will have computed granularity. granularity might be the period of a particular volume.
Much worse is in the modern world, preprints have many, many different possible publication dates.
Okay. So preprint dates. So how would we deal with that?
You mean versions?
Yeah.
Versioning.
Yeah, but how do we specify that? So if does it have the same identifier? It has the same URL in archive, for example, yeah?
No, the URL
No.
changes, the identifier stays.
Yes, they add V1, V2,
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, for that, we're going to end up with some kind of version arrow, blah, blah, blah. And if you don't fill in the version, you don't, it represents somehow all versions. Okay.
Yes, sometimes people specify the date in which they accessed.
Yes, that's the most common one.
Right. I mean, that's for a website, is the access date.
Yep.
Oops. Was I just typing into that other notebook? That's terrible. Okay, so let's loop back to what we can actually implement. Okay, so where are we here? So what we've got, I mean, first thing is to do. First thing is the external identifier business, which we are, I think, in a position to do. Alan? We already have a bunch of cases of that.
Right. So this is the thing that we want to return when you ask for. I mean, would we have a property of an entity that is like external identifier?
Yes.
Return the list of things.
I would think so. External identifiers. We already talked about that.
Right.
Would return.
So, that would be a list of external identifier objects, right? Because they're all fully specified with what the external system is.
Yeah. So it could be all kinds of different things, and a given, a given thing might have 10 of those or something.
What's the way to query for the external identifier in a specific system? We'll have to look at the list of these and agree on a naming.
I think yes, but I think for the popular ones they can be properties. I mean, in other words, there might be an obscure crossover that there's an IMDb thing for some who knows what. I would say that for a given thing, for a movie there's an IMDb ID, right? If there happens to be an IMDb ID for,
there are IMDb IDs for people.
Yes. Well, I don't know is the answer. I mean, we might, Michael, I mean, what would we do? What would be another way that what we have, because this is an extensible property thing for which property attributes are the most common way to do it. This is essentially a property instance.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I mean, they could be attributes, and it could be entity property type external identifier. I don't know. Identifier system goes to blah blah blah.
Right, but I think the first step is for us to just start putting in. Well, okay. So the question is, the other way we could do this is to say external identifier, essentially external identifier rules, and to have this thing on the right-hand side be a list of, DOI goes to, IMDb ID goes to, etc. Right, so that then we could have, so that would be a little bit better defined in terms of,
But
I mean, or we could just have these be as yeah.
Is the right-hand side just the ID part, or it's still a full external identifier? Because that's kind of
I think it should be. Well, yes. I mean, that's a mess, isn't it? I mean, so the other possibility is that that every identifier relevant to a given entity is a top-level property of that entity. It's not obviously totally ridiculous.
Why don't we actually, Josh and Ben and Tony and I had discussed this a little bit this morning. Why don't we sketch out some specific cases of this and come back and try to pin down the design?
Okay, all right. So that's the external identifier business. So the other action item here is the bibliographic citation, bibliographic item. Okay, so are we in a position? So what would we want for bibliographic items? So what we want is what we basically want is import plus export are the two things we want. So the import would be, read a journal citation and put it in canonical form.
In which format is it available?
What do you mean? Is it which
What do you
format
mean
can it
by
come out?
read?
Well, I'm saying let's take one of these bib items.
But it's a string, basically.
Yeah, it's a string.
In a PDF file.
Yeah, it would be a string. It would look like this. It would look. I mean, it's the typical stuff that interpreters eat.
Okay.
But
right?
BibTeX is already much more organized because it has fields.
Sure, fine, okay, but that's great. In that case, we have an easier time.
Exactly.
Okay, but I mean, fundamentally, what this is going to be is interpreter of bibliographic item of, and then let's say, John Smith physrev let, and we can allow, the fact that I don't have periods and things like this, the usual stuff, right? Do we already have,
No.
anything? Okay, there must exist in the world stuff that does this. I mean, this is a parsing project, right? To be able to read something like that. And to be able to read so is it the case that most of these things, are there JSON formats and things like that for these things, or are they mostly just strings?
I think the standard thing is to create huge BibTeX files in which each entry is organized by fields already.
Okay, but when you say organized by fields, is it like a rows and columns type thing, or is it like each thing just says things like author equals? I think I was seeing some of them in other places here, and it was just like author equals.
Exactly, author equals, exactly.
But I mean, something like this, that's kind of horrifying thing, is presumably, I don't know whether we already have parsing for that. Apparently not, by the time that it's taking. But that's an ISSN, basically. There should be an ISSN for that. Okay, so I mean, that's one of our challenges, is to parse those things.
Good.
And as I understand it, any journal that wants to get fourth-class postage in the US has to have an ISSN. So I believe they really all do. Oh, what about electronic journals? Do they have ISSNs? Yes, they do. People like to get them, but I think the ISSNs are given out by the post office, aren't they? Or am I mistaken about that?
I would have thought that's Library of Congress, but maybe not.
No, ISBNs are given out by BAUCA. They have nothing to do with Library of Congress.
Really? Okay.
They're a private organization that gives them out. So ISSN is, let's see, who are we? Let's ask that. It's an intergovernmental organization created in 1976. Great. Okay, and that's a picture of their building in Paris. Okay, so they really exist. There's an identifier,
right.
And the identifier is the building at 45 Rue de whatever. Okay, but it's also saying there are, okay.
So it's like ICANN.
I guess. I mean, let's look at the one for the US. Well, wait a minute. I'm pretty sure the post office has something to do with it in the US, but I might be wrong. Oh, it didn't work. Oh, well. Okay, but in any case, there is a notion of canonicalization okay, so one of the things we need then is an interpreter that goes that way and turns it into something which is probably similar to the BibTeX fields, right? Except that the BibTeX fields, as you were saying before, aren't well canonicalized. They're kind of what you feel like. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so then what we need is export, which is taking our canonical form, which will be a bibliographic item, blah, 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 bibliographic item of blah, 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 blah. And we'll take that. And then, I mean, then the question is, what we want to do is we want to be able to say export string, bibliographic item, BI, whatever, as, what is it, APA style citation or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that will then generate a string, which is, well, actually, it might not be a string because it might need to be formatted in some way. How would the string be specified as formatted?
And then it's a row.
Yeah, row of boxes, I guess.
Okay, so it might be.
Well, it's like the argument to.
It's an element.
Text
So right. So this could be a string, or it could be boxes. You know, or it could be, what would the thing be called? Formatted or something. Well, might be boxes, but I don't really like that name. But anyway, that's so that would then give, so that takes this citation and puts it in that form. Okay. And then there might be some centralized place where you can go from, okay, so now there's external services, right? And an external service might be something that says, well, actually, we could have something like, given an external identifier that is a DOI, right? DOI, whatever number the DOI has, then we should be able to look up that as a bibliographic item. So we might want to do, this might be an abuse, but we could potentially say bibliographic item of that, and that could use an external service to try and populate the citation information.
I would rather keep this as it is, because it has all information that you ever wanted, where the reverse is non-trivial. Of course, we could auto-populate it with itself.
No. But what I'm asking is, how do you go, the thing you were showing me, the cross-ref thing,
yeah,
right? Of way up at the top, somewhere here, where you have this thing where you're calling, where was it?
A little bit down here.
There, where you're calling crossref,
Yeah.
and where what it's doing is it's returning what we should be able to put into a bibliographic item, right?
But I think kind of like the DOI itself is a good bibliographic item. I feel like that's like expand normalized. That's a function that I put on top of it.
Fine, but what this is doing is, okay, what we want, okay, fair enough. So what we're trying to say is, really what this is bibliographic data of
Yes,
external identifier, and then there's a standard set of bibliographic data, which would be, okay, so this is probably not what we want here. Okay, so the correct thing is something more like this, where bibliographic data would then go use the external service to do this, to populate it. That makes some sense there.
yeah, I agree.
Okay, so then this would return potentially a bibliographic item, could return a bibliographic item, I think.
Yeah.
That has a bunch of information.
Yeah.
And then what you would do here is you would say, you know, full citation or something, or whatever it is. Or you could say, you know, full citation, comma, abstract, or something like this. Authors, comma, abstract. Okay. So, okay, this seems to me to make sense.
Going back up to your export string boxes, maybe boxes would be cell. Does that make more sense?
Oh yeah, that makes more sense. But I don't know what, yeah, because there will be an inline cell of some kind that is that
Correct.
citation.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you could imagine things with, you know, formatted hyperlink, you could imagine as another possibility. All kinds of different things here. That once we have this, So I mean, the computability, the interpreter, then the main thing it's got to do is it's got to recognize the journal ID. It's got to figure out what's the volume, because people are going to write silly things like, in this there will be many variants, which we surely, I mean, this is a solved problem. Citation, parsing is something people have talked about for millions of years, haven't they? I mean, aren't there all these I think there used to be services that did that. Wasn't there a Skytation or something? I don't remember what it was. There was something that did that years ago. I remember running into the CEO of that company.
So if it's a solved problem, you're thinking it's a service we can access, maybe.
It's a service we can access. It's a thing we can license. It's a library that just exists. I don't know. I mean, I remember that company. I talked to that CEO on at a random conference, probably 29 years ago. I could probably find out who it was. And that person had a small company that just did, I'm pretty sure it was just doing this. And I think maybe they sold themselves to Thomson Reuters or something. But again, I think, I'm surprised we haven't we encountered this in the past? Being able to, because then, what we want to be able to do is then to transform it into whatever, output form, and having it as a data set. So for example, what we want here when we interpret it, the interpreter is returning a bibliographic item in all cases, right? Which we can, if we want to, bibliographic item, and the bibliographic item could be that bibliographic item then has its own properties, right?
Yes, I think it should contain the information which is in the string, and then some other function will try to get from there the identifier.
Yes, I understand, but I mean, for example, this could say data set, and that could give a data set that corresponds to that bibliographic item.
Right.
I mean, it's also conceivable that we could have, that this could say, APA citation. That's another possible way that we could turn this into, that we could get out something like that as an alternative, right? Rather than this. Might actually be better. If there are a limited number of citation formats. Am I right about APA? Is that right? American Psychological Association or something? Is that a citation format?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think we should, do we think we've come to reasonable conclusions here?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Time to wrap this up. So I don't know if anybody's actually been eavesdropping on all of this, but if they have, I hope they found it interesting.
Can you send me the notebook?
Absolutely. And take it from there. who was project managing here? Sorry, I've forgotten already.
Ben H.
Okay. All right. Great. All right.